you, and welcome this evening, everyone as you're joining in for this evening's open house and workshop on the Grimsby Beach land use study. It's great to be with you, although virtual. We're looking forward to your input this evening. I did want to note that the session this evening is going to be recorded.
Recording in progress.
Thank you. My name is Dana Anderson. I'm a planner and with MHBC Planning, and we've been part of a consulting team along with Tarandis Associates in Crozier Engineering, working with the town and the town staff through the Grimsby Beach land use study process. And I'm pleased to be joined this evening by a number of members of staff as well. And before we get started, I just wanted to note that there will be a brief overview presentation this evening, but really the focus of tonight's workshop is to hear from you, to hear your comments and your input and your questions as we're going through to the next stage of the study. So on that note, you have a number of ways in which you can participate this evening. Feel free to populate the chat function, which you'll find across the toolbar on the Zoom webinar, and you can type into the chat your comments or questions. There's also a Q&A where you can type in questions and we'll be responding to those. Staff are going to be monitoring those. And if you would like to, you can use the raise hand function, and staff will look to unmute and you'll be able to ask your question live as well. So lots of different ways to participate as we go through this evening's session. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Antonetta, the planning director for the town, who has a few opening remarks.
Thanks, Dana. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the open house and workshop to discuss the draft Grimsby Beach secondary plan and zoning bylaw amendment. This has been an exciting project for the town to create a land use planning strategy for a unique area that has many wonderful and eclectic features, as well as some challenges. We have had many opportunities for the community to be engaged in this study, and we're glad that so many of you have taken those opportunities and provided your feedback along the way, as it has helped to both shape and inform this study. Before we begin, we thought it would be beneficial to provide some overall information. Council directed staff to conduct a land use planning study for the Grimsby Beach area. As a result of that study, and through significant public consultation, it was determined that a secondary plan was the best approach for the Grimsby Beach area. This would ensure that policies are included within the town's official plan that can provide guidance for when development applications are received in the future. The secondary plan is intended to address, where it can, the many issues and concerns that the community has raised throughout this study. This neighborhood is unique, which is why so many tools have been recommended. In addition to the secondary plan, with Grimsby Beach specific policies, a zoning bylaw amendment, urban design and heritage guidelines, fiscal impact statement, and tree strategy are also out for review. In addition, planning staff are in the process of undertaking heritage evaluations of over 200 properties in the Grimsby Beach community to determine if they should be included on the Heritage Register. Since advertising for the original open house and public meeting that was planned for early November, it has come to our attention that there may be some desire for a heritage conservation district within the Grimsby Beach community. Through the study, the possibility of an HCD, Heritage Conservation District, was raised, and there did not seem to be support for this concept. Regardless of whether it is pursued or not, we want to clarify that a Heritage Conservation District is a tool that is intended to preserve heritage-built form. It is important to note that both heritage and cultural values have been identified in the Grimsby Beach area. And while this began as an area with a rich historical background, over time, it has evolved into one with an artistic cultural theme that is different from that Methodist campground. Heritage conservation districts can be used to preserve constructed heritage. The district can also obstruct some of the cultural value of the areas, as much of the artistic expression conflicts with heritage guidelines and industry best practices, especially around concepts of falsification. The decision for a district is not out of the question in the future, but it is not one that we should focus on this evening. Tonight's meeting is focused on making sure that the policies in the draft secondary plan and draft zoning bylaw amendment reflect the future direction for this community. We will be walking through the documents section by section to explain and look for suggestions on how we can improve them together. Tonight, we have the chance to ensure that those documents protect the heritage and cultural value while address the other issues and concerns in the community without limiting that artistic expression we all appreciate and love. If you have examples or suggestions, please do raise them. We want to ensure that these documents are clear and reflect the intention for the community. The documents will be revised prior to the public meeting. The public meeting, which we anticipate will be held on January 27th, and the recommendation report on the secondary plan and draft zoning bylaw will follow shortly thereafter to council. We recognize that this community has had an interim control bylaw for almost 2 years, and the intention is to ensure that policies and regulations are in place prior to the expiry of that interim control bylaw in May. Our consultant, Dana from MHBC, will be walking us through a brief presentation prior to our section by section review. We look forward to working with you to understand how these documents can be enhanced to suit the goals of this community. Thank you for your time this evening and your participation.
That's great. Thanks so much, Antonetta. And a lot of what I was going to say in the introduction, just in terms of the next steps, sort of in our presentation this evening, I think you covered. And I just wanted to reiterate, and again, welcome everyone, and reiterate the purpose of tonight really is to provide clarification on some matters that have been raised since I believe we had our last webinar session, but also to take the time to walk through these documents, the draft secondary plan and the zoning bylaw, so that we can convey the information that's in those documents and respond to any questions or comments that the community may have. So very briefly, what we intend to do this evening is walk through a little bit of the process. I think it's important to sort of understand where we started and where we are right now. And so a quick recap of the process, really to highlight that this process, as Antonetta indicated, was at the direction of council through a request for proposal and the approval of a work program. And that work program, as you can see, is set out in the 5 phases. And that's generally been followed as we started off in phase 1. And I won't go through this in detail, but we certainly started with a lot of engagement with the community, an opportunity to have walking tours in person. And we also established a technical advisory committee and a stakeholder advisory committee who were integral in the process, providing input at each stage, reviewing information, providing feedback and comments in an iterative way as we moved on to the next steps and the next phases of the work program. And so as we went along with most work programs, they evolve and they change. And in the case of this study in particular, as we sort of moved into phase 2, and we started focusing on developing a vision, goals, and objectives for that land use planning framework, we also looked at the various approaches and tools that we could consider for Grimsby Beach. And we did that through engagement with the community in exploring those approaches and tools and providing examples and getting feedback as to which approach and tools is the most suitable for the Grimsby Beach context. We also then moved into starting to draft the report and recommendations that would lead to the preferred approach and the framework for that approach, which, as Antonetta indicated, is the secondary plan and the zoning bylaw. But also to add that that secondary plan and zoning bylaw is supported by a number of draft implementation plans and additional tools that we'll touch on this evening. And so you can see from the work program where we are to date, we've added this separate public open house and workshop this evening, which will continue to lead to revisions and refinements to the secondary plan and the zoning bylaw, and moving into the new year with a statutory public meeting, which again is another opportunity for the community to provide its input and comments on those documents and the process. And that moves forward, hopefully in the new year, to a final recommendation to council as that final secondary plan and zoning bylaw goes forward. And as I mentioned, along the way, the process has evolved, and it's done so in a very positive way and in response to a number of questions and matters that have come up throughout the process. Early on, several changes were made. As we did the walking tour, it was actually evident that there were certain areas of Grimsby Beach in terms of the study area that needed to be considered to be added to the study area so that appropriate policies were applied to those areas regardless of the land use planning approach. Also added were significant concerns that related to signage and concerns around parking. And so in addition to the work that was undertaken by the engineering consultants, the town actually also added additional steps and community input specific to that particular matter. Also, a number of inquiries were raised throughout the process, which we took and the town took to move forward with additional improvements and work that was outside the land use planning process, but very important as a key element to Grimsby Beach, including concerns in and around tourism within the area. So all of that has been part of the study, although not directly related to the land use or the land use planning framework, but certainly important to recognize the input of the community on those particular matters. So one of the things I wanted to note too with the study as we sort of move towards the approach, and I'm going to sort of speak to this a little bit in the next slide, and that is how has the process led to the key planning documents that Antonetta referred to in her introduction, and that is the draft secondary plan and the draft zoning bylaw as the land use planning framework and the preferred land use planning framework, which again is supported by a number of implementation plans and tools. And certainly as we commenced the study, one of the most important aspects of the study was establishing a context. And that was how the character of Grimsby Beach is defined and how that character can be managed and preserved going forward into the future in the land use planning document. And identifying what elements, what elements of that what elements of that context and that character can be addressed in the land use planning framework. So it was very important early on to establish the various approaches, as I mentioned, and evaluate those to come up with the preferred approach. And that was done through an assessment in the planning report. And that planning report sets out those various tools, the assessment of those tools and approaches, and the recommendations, and also provides an overall framework for what the draft secondary plan and draft zoning bylaw shall include. But it also speaks to those implementation tools and the importance of those in supporting the new draft secondary plan and zoning bylaws. And those include a tree strategy, urban design and heritage guidelines, as well as an infrastructure plan and fiscal impact assessment, and some other tools that I will mention in a moment. But it's important to note that in the tree strategy, there are a number of strategies to address not only tree preservation, but tree enhancement and the canopy within the Grimsby Beach area. And I will speak in a little bit of detail to the urban design and heritage guidelines. But again, this is a document that reflects those two aspects to the character of the area, not just the built form and design and some of those very unique recent characteristics that really define the character of the current area, but also those the cultural heritage of significant importance that has been historically developed. And then in terms of other work and studies, I think it's important to note that the secondary plan itself actually sets out and provides direction on a number of additional areas that need to be considered for Grimsby Beach. Again, not a static process, one that will continue to be addressed as the process moves forward. So other work and studies that are actually referenced in the secondary plan include the analysis of storm sewers in the area to address issues of erosion protection at the outfall locations, As I mentioned earlier, the actual installation of new signage for the streets and the parking areas, as well as the establishment of a deeming bylaw. And this is a bylaw that would address some of the existing lotting under some of the historical plans and determining how to best move forward with establishing the existing parcel fabric. In addition, some further assessment to the shoreline areas that was identified in the initial Tarandis report. And finally, and very importantly, developing a public realm master plan to identify all areas within Grimsby Beach that are public areas and recommending
Recording in progress.
Areas that might not be utilized now for public access, but can be enhanced to provide for those public accessible spaces. I won't go through this in detail, and this was outlined in one of the recent staff reports, but it just really highlights the importance of the communication and the engagement throughout the process. And Antonetta touched on some of these early on, but it was very important for us as the consultants to hear from you and to understand as we went through this iterative process, whether that was through the Stakeholder Advisory Committee or from members of the community through the online outreach or through the walking tour, understanding those issues and elements that you sought to have addressed through the land use planning framework, and to understand those concerns and how we could best address them through this process. And so what did we hear through the process? We have heard a considerable amount of comment and input as we've worked to develop the draft secondary plan and the zoning bylaw. And many of these areas in which we have received excellent input and information from the community actually relate and translate into areas of the secondary plan. So whether that's cultural heritage or how to best manage growth and change, design, access and connectivity, or shoreline protection, we have heard comments on all of these. And so these are actually reflected in many of the secondary plan policies, many in the goals and objectives, some specifically within the zoning bylaw, and many within the implementation documents. Some are addressed where appropriate and with distinction based on how they can best be addressed with supportive legislation. And in relation to heritage, that was certainly a matter of distinction in terms of those elements of built form and design, which are important to defining the character, but also the actual built cultural and cultural heritage built structures, as well as cultural heritage landscapes. So those two things work together, and I think it's important to see that as we walk through the secondary plan and the urban design and cultural heritage guidelines. And so before we sort of move right into the secondary plan, just a reminder of what a secondary plan is, which was outlined in the sort of land use approaches. Why was it chosen as the preferred approach for Grimsby Beach? How will it apply to Grimsby Beach, and what will it address? In terms of what a secondary plan is, technically it is an amendment to the town's existing official plan, and it's an amendment that provides for a specific geographic area, and shown on the screen is actually a map of what will be the Grimsby Beach secondary plan area, and that includes the enhanced boundary as evolved through the study. And the secondary plan itself is a policy document that sets out goals and objectives and a number of functional policies to address specific policy areas that will apply to Grimsby Beach. And so while the general official plan will still be applied to Grimsby Beach, it provides for those specific policies related to growth and change, most importantly in Grimsby Beach related to character and particular character areas that have been defined, and then general policies related to servicing, transportation, cultural heritage and urban design as it applies to the Grimsby Beach area. And it was determined through the process that this was the most appropriate approach because it would provide an initial comprehensive policy framework within which growth and change and character could be addressed. And it also allows for those additional tools and supportive implementation documents to be referenced. And that may also include additional tools, as was noted, that would come forward through the town's cultural heritage master plan. And it would not preclude the potential future development of a Heritage Conservation District plan. So with that, I'm going to ask Terry if she can share her screen, and we're going to take a walk through the actual secondary plan and just slowly walk through the different sections. And as we do that, if people have particular comments as we're going through the sections, please feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll be monitoring those, and we can be adding them into the document sort of through an iterative run through for this evening's workshop.
Sure. Bianca, can you just let me share the screen?
We should be good to go now.
Can everyone see that?
We can. That's great, Terry. So while Terry's going through that, I just wanted to note as we're going through, one of the things that I should note about the draft version of the secondary plan is in fact that it is certainly that it is a draft. And so as we go through, you'll note that there are some areas that are highlighted with some comments. And this is reflective of the comments that we've received since the webinar. And we've noted some areas that we are further reviewing based on the comments that have been received to date. So just going through the first section here, as Terry sort of scrolls through, as I mentioned, a secondary plan is an official plan amendment. And so it is adopted by bylaw, actually by council. That's how it's established through the legislative process. And so as such, it requires certain elements that include sort of a certification page and a preamble. And the preamble actually sets out the purpose of the amendment. It sets out the location of the amendment. And it also includes some information around the basis of the amendment. So what is the intention of the secondary plan? And so in this section, there is a reflection of the issues and matters that have been raised and that will be addressed through this plan. And it also references the connection of the secondary plan to the Town of Grimsby official plan, as well as the Niagara Region official plan. And I would also note at this section that once the plan is adopted by the council of the Town of Grimsby, it actually will go to the region of Niagara for approval, and the region has authority to make modifications in considering the secondary plan. And so the operative part of the secondary plan is actually the amendment. And in the case of the Grimsby Beach secondary plan, it will actually find its way as a new section in the town's official plan that will be referenced as section 13. And then it will have a number of policies within it that are structured in the way that I referenced in terms of goals, objectives, functional policies, and then implementation. So starting off really with the purpose, and again, this is reflective of the resulting purpose of the study to establish that land use planning framework. The secondary plan actually provides policies and directions with respect to the area that's now defined in the plan as the Grimsby Beach secondary plan area. And it's important here to provide context. So within the secondary plan itself, in addition to what I'll call operative policies, there are sections that provide a narrative that define the character of Grimsby Beach and define, in this case, the history, and also the importance of recognizing, in this case, that the area is situated within the recognized territory of the Anishinaabe Nation. And the area also being recognized for its historical importance in terms of its evolution as a religious gathering place in the 19th century, as is referenced by the Methodist campground. And so it's important early on to establish those important elements, and also talking about how the area has evolved and how through this process we've identified 3 distinct character areas, each with their own unique characteristics that define Grimsby Beach. The goal and objectives of the study are of the secondary plan are right up front. And the goal, as was established through the community with the visioning session, and then also provided with additional input through the community through online outreach, as well as through the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. Really important to recognize that the goal of the secondary plan is to proactively guide change that maintains and enhances the unique character of the area while protecting and conserving the natural and the cultural heritage features and the existing built form of the area, including the shoreline, the trees, the open spaces, and the parks. So a very clear vision for the importance of protecting and conserving the area and its characteristics. The objectives are then established around a number of key themes that come from that particular goal. And so if we look at each of those themes as they're expressed as objectives, we start with maintaining and conserving the character of Grimsby Beach and its uniqueness. And then underneath each of the objectives is really the how are we going to do that? And you'll see that there are various ways in which we've conveyed and expressed how we're going to achieve that objective, establishing and defining 3 character areas, providing for limited growth through development that is reflective of those character areas, and providing policies to protect and enhance the unique characteristics of that area. The second theme around protecting the shoreline and the natural and environmental features, how is that objective to be achieved? It shall be achieved by ensuring those features and buffers are identified and protected, as well as ensuring shoreline areas are protected and stabilized to reduce erosion. In terms of protecting and replenishing trees and canopy cover, again, a number of ways in which that objective is to be addressed, recognizing trees as a key element of the character of the area, ensuring tree canopy within the area is enhanced, protecting existing trees, ensuring they're maintained and preventing unnecessary removal, and acknowledging trees as green infrastructure. Also maintaining and enhancing parks, public open spaces, and connections throughout Grimsby Beach. And again, that objective, how is that to be met through this land use planning framework? By identifying those parks and open spaces as key elements that define the character of the area, maintaining and enhancing those areas and the public realm, protecting and reinforcing views and vistas within the area, and ensuring safe and effective traffic and pedestrian and cycling movement. Creating also a wayfinding signage strategy to provide environmental cues while enhancing community identity. And finally, in terms of the objective relating to identifying and conserving the significant cultural heritage resources, doing that by supporting conservation through the preparation of a conservation management plan, as well as employing urban design and heritage guidelines, and continuing to list and designate significant cultural heritage properties. And so in terms of the goal and objectives, these have been set out in the draft secondary plan, and we certainly look for your comments as we're going through. And I know we've had considerable comment both at the webinar and I understand following that session in relation to the objective around cultural heritage. And so that's certainly something in terms of input from the community, an area that we would look to add or support that particular objective through additional means. So I'll pause a little bit there. If anything is coming in, Terry's going to be typing away. Maybe moving on to the general policies. So the general policies, also referred to as functional policies, and they relate to a number of areas or elements. In the previous slide, I think we saw a number of the blurb or the bubbles that relate into the secondary plan. And this is where you'll see those general policies, functional policies applied with specific policies that would apply to Grimsby Beach. So I'll just walk through those. So we start off with the importance of land use and the land use designations. And the land use designations are established in the official plan. And these are provided for on the mapping, and they relate to land use designations and policies that are also included in the official plan. And so we are not recommending any changes to those existing land use designations. We are, however, recommending additional and specific policies as they relate to those designations. So the land use designations will be set out on Schedule L, which will be part of the plan, and we'll flip to that at the end. But that schedule will illustrate what the land use designations are for Grimsby Beach. They include the low density residential area, and those policies are outlined here in reference in the existing official plan. Environmental conservation areas, again, as provided for in the official plan. Environmental protection areas, hazard land overlay, which relates to the shoreline areas. Parks and open space areas, which are maintained and protected through the schedule and also referenced in policies in the official plan. And finally, institutional designation and as is provided and set out in section 310 of the official plan. So that's a reference to the land use designations and a reference to the schedule and additional policies that apply. And I would note that where there are conflicts between the policies in the official plan and new policies in a secondary plan, it's the policies of the secondary plan that prevail. So in terms of the functional policies, I'll start with the policies of growth management. And these are actually the policies that relate to the anticipated change within Grimsby Beach as it may relate to growth. And so this is an area where we have, and you'll see highlighted, we've received a number of comments. And most of the questions have been related to how we've defined growth and change within Grimsby Beach. And through the study, we had identified, and this is reflected in the infrastructure plan, that based on the current character of Grimsby Beach, based on the existing development, there would be limited growth that would be provided in the Grimsby Beach area. And we see that change within Grimsby Beach relating to housing that may be replaced, and also minor infill and the introduction of secondary suites. And secondary suites are defined as accessory suites that are accommodated within existing dwellings, but they may also be provided separately. And there are a number of other policies and provisions that are required to be addressed with the introduction of secondary suites. But we certainly see that as an opportunity for change that may, in some cases, be appropriate, but again, would have to be assessed with all of the policies that we're putting in place. In terms of replacement housing, we're definitely not encouraging all houses to be replaced. In fact, we're really just referencing that some homes based on particular circumstances may seek to be replaced within the area. Some of those, of course, would be subject to provisions and requirements of other legislation, including the Heritage Act, if they are listed or designated properties as well. And there may be an opportunity for minor infill. So we did note that there are a number of vacant lots within the area, and those lots could be developed. And we wanted to ensure that this secondary plan, the zoning bylaw, and those additional implementation tools provide appropriate guidance for that new housing that's coming forward. And so this section references the time frame within which the secondary plan would apply, and that's again all of the secondary plan must be in conformity with the town's official plan, the regional official plan, and provincial policy. So that's where you see the time frame of 2051 established. So again, we've identified that any replacement housing or new housing on vacant lots shall be assessed in accordance with the policies of the secondary plan, specifically the character area policies, and will require the protection of significant cultural heritage, natural heritage, and the protection and enhancement of those character areas. So we know that we've received some comments related to this and some need for refinement and clarification. So that's certainly something that we have highlighted to further review and refine as we go forward. So we look for your comments on that. So probably one of the most important areas of functional policies.
Sorry, Dana, I'm seeing some Q&As and some chat. I can't quite see them, but I thought I saw a hand raised as well. I'm not sure if anybody had any comments on this section.
I think I saw a question about secondary suites. So the best way to define, I think, a secondary suite is in an existing home, it would be an opportunity to provide for an additional dwelling unit. So it would be, in some cases, often referenced as a additional unit, a basement apartment often is defined under secondary suites. It could also be, in some cases, a rear addition, with a separate access. And in some cases, it could be what we're often referred to as a coach house or a granny flat. So it would be a separate unit on a lot. Again, introducing secondary suites is subject to a number of policies and provisions and would not necessarily be provided in all areas of Grimsby Beach, or certainly not on all lots or in existing homes.
Just a proviso, the current official plan does not have the allowance for a separate secondary suite.
Oh, thank you for that clarification.
All right. Yeah.
So while it is recognized that that may be a form, again, the current official plan would not provide for that. So I think some people are looking for those questions, and I'm not sure. It may be that the chat function is coming in, I think, through the town. So we'll try and highlight those as we go, as they relate to these sections. So I don't know, Terry, if there's anything else, or Antonetta, that we need to address now before we move on.
There is one question. I have one concern over the growth management section, where it states in brackets where all other requirements are met. Does this mean that there will be no leeway for minor variances?
So that's an excellent question. And certainly, because a minor variance actually provides for relief to a zoning bylaw, it does provide for an opportunity where someone is seeking to introduce, say, a new house on a vacant lot to address an area of the zoning bylaw where they may need to seek relief. Now, having said that, where all other requirements are met, minor variances are subject to tests under the Planning Act, which include meeting the general intent and purpose of the official plan and the zoning bylaw. So certainly with the new secondary plan policies in place and the new zoning bylaw in place, minor variances would be assessed in accordance with those updated policies and zoning provisions.
There's a few more. I want to make sure we get them. There was the question about secondary suites being expanded. We've done that. And then Nicole Patterson says she has her hand up and would like to ask a question.
Hi, Nicole, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm a little bit confused because I understand that for heritage homes, obviously demolition will not be possible. But when I'm reading the urban design and heritage guidelines, I believe it's on page 31. They're talking about for any new proposed housing, you have to show that the house is of no culture, is not of significant cultural heritage value or interest, and that there is no reasonable alternative to demolition. So I don't really like. It seems contradictory. I get that you're trying to save heritage homes, but if a home is not heritage, why would somebody not be able to take it down and rebuild?
Well, that's a great question, Nicole. And I think when we get to the heritage guidelines, I can look to that specific section. But in terms of replacement housing, you're right. If there is an existing home, if it doesn't have those protections under the Heritage Act, I think because it would also be an assessment and required to go through the site plan process. The question on demolition, I mean, in fact, the Heritage Act is what would require that assessment if it is a listed property. But if it is not, then it would be subject to demolition and redevelopment. Having said that, in many cases, prior to demolition, the municipality can consider looking at plans for that replacement home and doing the assessment under those guidelines to ensure that that replacement house, as it's coming forward, addresses those requirements that are put in place. So some municipalities do that as projects move through site plan. They have that condition on demolition to have that quick assessment, albeit not a heritage, a listed property or certainly designated, to do that initial assessment and to also understand what that new home may look like. So it is an option. but it's certainly something we can look at in terms of refining that language in the guidelines to make it clear.
Yeah, because here it says there is no reasonable alternative to demolition.
Yeah, and I think that must be referencing more of the listed properties, and I think we'll need to clarify that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Dana, I have a quick question. How will you define minor infill?
So minor infill is again, that's why it's highlighted, because this came up a number of times. Minor infill, I think we're defining as the development of a vacant lot, and it may include the consolidation of lots for a new home. But I don't think we're looking at any form of intensification sort of beyond that hierarchy. In other areas of the town, there's certainly a direction for, a much greater level of intensification. And we're simply here looking at the addition of a new home on a vacant lot, or perhaps the consolidation of lots. It could involve a severance where maybe 2 new lots are created, and so 2 new homes would be proposed. But again, severances and those 2 new homes would be subject to additional processes that would all be assessed through the secondary plan policies and the new zoning bylaw.
Okay. And another question. Secondary suites are presently defined as suites within the interior space of a single detached or semi-detached dwelling. However, there are also exterior secondary suites within the town of Grimsby that have been permitted when they are co-joined with a covered walkway or breezeway, even though they are separate buildings. Having a breezeway as a link supposedly means they are connected as part of a primary building and therefore allowed. Here is an example of this at 250 Main Street East. This is a loophole circumventing the actual definition of a secondary suite. Grimsby Beach is already limited for parking, traffic, and space. This type of detached secondary suite should not be permitted in the historic Grimsby Beach core, and that should be in writing on any plan.
So great comment. And yes, in terms of ensuring, again, that the character and those other elements you mentioned in terms of parking and limitations need to be addressed. So we'll certainly ensure that that's quite clear in this language at the beginning here. That, again, that's why it's highlighted.
Perfect. And I'm hoping the community can see that Terry's writing these notes in the side margins. We have screenshots of everything, and we'll take all that language and put it in there as appropriate. I have a question. Terry McDonald, he has his hand up. So if we can let Terry in and have him ask their question.
Hi, Terry, can you hear me?
Yes, I just unmuted.
Yeah, I can hear you, Terry. Thank you.
Okay. Terry, can you once again confirm, if I heard you correctly, that at this time, secondary suites are not permitted here in the Grimsby Beach area?
No, sorry. I was saying in the official plan generally, there is a permission that you can have like a second suite within the building. It's just not in a separate building. Our official plan does not have that proviso that Dana was talking about earlier. So I was just trying to clarify that point. That's all.
Okay, thank you. So currently then in our town plan, if somebody wanted to put a basement apartment in their existing dwelling, that's permitted?
Subject to all of the other policies and zoning in that area, that it's part of the plan that actually the Planning Act requires us to consider and allow those within residential dwellings.
Well, upon the existing the existing dwelling itself, nothing outside, like the secondary or the coach house or the examples that Dana was giving us.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, and so my follow-up question is, because what I understand it, from here is that with the plan going forward, that there is potential that that clause would be in there, which allows for other buildings on the property, given that it meets all the other requirements, which would be different from what we have currently.
Yeah, and maybe I can clarify, Terry, that's not the intent. I think we need to conform to the existing official plan, so we'll make that clarification in the secondary plan. And I also think it's important to note, as Terry said, there are a number of additional policies that apply to where a secondary suite may be considered. And that includes additional zoning provisions as they may relate to parking and other requirements, but also requirements under the building code that may not be achievable on a number of sites or lots or within existing homes in the area. So we'll make that clarification, but I think it's important to note that we've highlighted this to clarify that these policies need to conform with the OP, and we'll need to clarify that it's consistent with the OP, that they would not be provided as external units.
Yeah, because what I'm trying to get at is, was this something that we as a community asked to have included as potential to be considered, or is it something that has been part of other plans that you may have looked to as models?
Yeah, so it's certainly in terms of a requirement for I'll say change or additional units. It is something that is prescribed under provincial policy to be provided for in official plans, but municipalities do have the authority to identify sort of how and in this case the form. And so I think we want to be very careful as to how we provide for it. We did hear from some people in the community that this was something that they saw would be an appropriate way to provide for additional housing units, because in fact it wouldn't change any of, in some cases, the exterior of the home. And it's certainly in many communities a way in which individual units can be somewhat expanded to accommodate additional family or other individuals to provide for that additional housing. But it is, again, something we flagged, something we know there are concerns about, and something we need to appropriately define with more clarification here.
Okay, thanks for that. Dana, I just want to note, we're getting messages that people think we can't see their hands. We can see their hands. We're just going in order in which we're seeing them. So bear with us. We're going to get to everyone. I have Nicole Patterson. I'm assuming that that's your hand up from before. And I have a new hand up from Wayne Mullins. Mr. Mullins, we'll let you in and then we can test your audio.
Mr. Mullins, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thanks.
My question has to do with your comments recognizing Grimsby Beach as being a historic place, and the recommendation in your report that the standards for historic places in Canada should be followed when the detailed plans are drawn up. So having said that, and looking at the standards for historic places in Canada, don't the recommendations for replacement housing, infill, secondary suites, and all of that go against the historic place standards?
So that's an excellent question. And my response would be, depending on the particular context, there may be particular homes and particular areas where that would not apply. But there are other parts of Grimsby Beach where we have to balance other provincial requirements and objectives in managing change that is otherwise provided for, in terms of the ability of someone that may have an older home, not of historic significance under those standards or the legislation, and the ability to replace that home. There also may be some situations where there are, as we've identified, vacant lots where someone is developing a new home, and there would be a requirement to put in place, guidance for the development of that new home or homes, and also as required under the policies, the provision for secondary suites through the provincial direction. So we're identifying this section. Maybe we shouldn't call it growth management. Maybe we should call it change management. It's intended to note that where and how there will be change that occurs, that this is the limitations that we perceive of that change based on our work, and how that change will be addressed, and very clear that that change is within very much a prescribed set of policies and additional guidelines to ensure that it meets the policies of the area, which, the main goal, again, to protect significant cultural and heritage resources, as well as the natural areas. So I do agree that there are likely areas under those standards that are, designated properties, or they may be listed properties, where in fact that replacement may not be something that can be achieved, but some change even to those particular homes are still permitted through permits under the Heritage Act. So again, that is guided through these policies. And where there is a vacant lot, the development of a new home or homes would be guided through these policies. So we're just reflecting what the change could be and how that change will be addressed.
Okay, we have another question here. Well, first there's two comments. There's a mention of garages with second-story living. How will people be able to afford to live in Grimsby Beach if they are not allowed secondary suites? This feels elitist. Another question, you noted that minor infill could be a consolidation of lots or severance of two lots to create two new homes. Are the current historic plans and tent lots legally registered plans of subdivision? The consultant recommended a deeming bylaw, which would consolidate abutting lots owned by the same owner to prevent severing and over-intensification so that only one home could be built on the merged property with setbacks and lot coverage. How does the deeming bylaw protect the area from severances that might over-intensify the area?
So I can respond by saying exactly how the comment set out, and that is that the deeming bylaw would establish those older tent lots where as one lot, as a consolidation. So technically one lot would allow for one additional home. And so it is something that as a technical matter has been added because there have been, as is set out in the planning report, a number of the original lots in the older historic plans that have been consolidated and through that deeming process established. And so that is something that we've outlined as an additional process to really reflect the existing character of the area where those homes are overlaid. So I think that what was put forward in that question actually responded to it quite well.
The next question related to this one is, where are these vacant lots? Would they not be offered to the neighboring property owner?
So the vacant lots, I believe, are established in one of the background reports. There's a schedule that identifies the location of those lots. They are separate conveyable lots. If, for instance, they were offered on the market for sale, neighboring property owners could consider that purchase and consolidation. But we did identify that there are some vacant lots that could, in fact, be developed with new housing.
And the last question I see, where will the additional families or tenants of these secondary suites park in the core of Grimsby Beach? And to that, I'll just say, I think that's why Terry said subject to all other zoning bylaws and applicable pieces, because our policy requires them to have a parking spot before even qualifying to build for a secondary suite. So that's all taken care of. I don't know if there's any additions to that from your end on that question, Dana.
No, I don't think so. I think, yeah, again, the concern about additional units would have to be developed in compliance with all the zoning requirements. And and even building code requirements, which may not be even achievable on many of the lots, especially within the core area. And we've reflected that in the planning report.
So with that, we're all caught up with questions in the chat and the Q&A.
Okay, that's great. And those are all excellent comments. And again, that section's highlighted, and it was good to have this discussion because we know there's a lot of concerns when we speak about growth and change within the area, and it is something we have to address. And I'm very appreciative of the comments that came forward. The next section in the secondary plan relates to character areas, and this is probably one of the most important sections in terms of talking about context and establishing the character of Grimsby Beach. And it's described in these sections in a number of ways. It's talking about, the built form characteristics, talking about the characteristics in terms of the natural areas, the landscaped areas, the parks, as well as those significant cultural heritage resources, and most significantly as well, the trees. So in this section of the secondary plan, we have identified the importance of defining the characteristics of Grimsby Beach as a very unique area, and in some cases, one that has sort of evolved with some really interesting recent changes and some of the things that we visually see that really define the area as well, and not just those historic features. So one of the most important things is that development be compatible with the existing built form and character of Grimsby Beach. And we flagged this because we heard concerns that we also want to ensure that I'll call it some of the diversity, the eclectic nature of some of the built form and character is also not lost, and that we're not replicating one particular built form or one particular characteristic. So we flagged this to provide some perhaps refinements as it relates to the character elements. Again, we list that the requirements for replacement housing or infill must address the policies for each of the character areas. So again, differences between the core and the northeast and the south area, and a few differences in terms of how, for instance, the characteristics of those areas, whether it's scale, massing, building height, lot areas, lot frontages, the landscaped features, and also recognizing that in any of the areas, it's really important to ensure protection against impacts on adjacent properties. So whether that's privacy or overlook, and also looking at the design of driveways and garages to be compatible, which again, may be very different in the different character areas. Finally, there's a notation here about views and vistas, and we've specifically defined those within the character areas. So in this section, there is a description of each of the character areas, including policies that relate to land use, urban design, cultural heritage, and implementation, and a narrative of each of those areas to define that character and the assets of that area. And you'll note here, my comment is to add some clarification around cultural heritage properties in terms of listed and designated properties. So we'll certainly add that to the urban design and heritage guidelines as well. So just looking at the 3 areas.
Anna, before we move on, sorry, we have a question.
Okay.
Nicole Patterson.
Nicole, can you hear me?
I can, sorry. Hi, sorry. In terms of, I understand, why the policies are there, but have you considered a right of entry bylaw for those houses that are butting on property lines or actually even touching each other? I mean, currently now you have to request permission from your neighbor to take care of your property, which, in some cases they will always say yes, and others they'll say no. And I think that in the core area, there's at least, over 40% of the houses have less than 4 feet between them and the next property. And if we really want to, take care of this neighborhood, leaving it up to the mercy of your neighbor on whether you can take care of your property, I think that is, risky at least. And I know that other jurisdictions in Ontario have a policy where you can actually go on your property's go on your neighbor's property to do repairs.
That's
Sorry,
a
that
great
was a long question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Nicole. And I would say that one of the things we heard very early on, and I know it's a sensitive issue as well, is that there are a number of areas which sort of would require that, and there are situations where there's encroachment into public areas and public areas that are actually private areas, and certainly better defining that and understanding that first, and then assessing how that can best be addressed to make sure that there is that opportunity to access those areas. There are certainly areas with zero lot lines, and as I mentioned, some encroachment. So one of the things we've recommended through the study, and it's set out in the secondary plan, is something called a public realm master plan, but that can also be enhanced by starting to take a look at some of those areas where there are some encroachments and concerns. And it's sort of a matter outside of the public realm master plan, because that's really intended to address public areas. But in terms of achieving perhaps easements or other, as you say, right of entry type easement agreements, is really between the private property owners, but where there is some form of publicly accessible area, it's certainly something that can be looked at through the public realm master plan. But it's probably an area for further discussion that we highlighted in the report that does need to be addressed. And it needs to be addressed, I think, in terms of maybe a policy and an approach going forward, because I do understand there's many in the community who would seek perhaps some additional access, and making sure that that's a consistent approach, because I think historically it's sort of been established and then it's in place. But certainly going forward, maybe there's more of a consistent approach to how that type of access or easement or encroachment is addressed.
Thank you.
We're good from a Q&A and chat perspective.
Okay. So I did want to take a little bit of time just to convey again, and I won't read these in detail, but I think it's really important to note that in the secondary plan for the three areas, the core, and I apologize, the map is kind of coming at the end. That's how the plan is structured. But for the core and the area referred to as the Northwest and then the South, for each of these character areas, there's a description. And the intention of that is to sort of provide an overall narrative about the area, its sort of historical development, and also talking importantly about the existing features today. And so what's important in the core area, as you'll note in sort of the second paragraph, is the really interesting and unique characteristics of the bright colors and some of the changes that have occurred, some of the murals, and just some of the enhancements in the existing community that has occurred. And that's where sort of some of the more historic cultural built heritage and cultural landscape features are now really well connected with some of those unique characteristics of design and built form that have evolved and continue to evolve in the area. So for the core area, we have that narrative and description. We also have a series of policies. And again, we've highlighted here, highlighting unique architectural character and heritage attributes. So again, not just one or the other, but the two together, really defining the uniqueness of the core. And we talk about a number of the other features, including the streetscape, the landscape features, lotting patterns and building setbacks, which certainly does not follow an absolute consistent pattern. It's very reflective of sort of the historical pattern and something quite unique to that core area, including the patterns and sizes of the landscaped areas and how the homes are oriented and situated in different locations throughout the core, and also the size of those homes and lots being very different. So I think that's really important to reflect right up front in terms of the core. And then in terms of urban design and cultural heritage, as well as implementation, we heard a lot of comments, particularly in the core, about the views and vistas, reflecting that it's not just the views and vistas outward from Grimsby Beach, from the core area outward towards the lake, but it's also the views coming in and the views coming along some of the areas. So we've highlighted this section because we know we need to consider some additional views and vistas that have been raised through the comments. and to reflect those on the schedule. So this is an area that we're going to take that input and update and revise. We certainly welcome your comments in this particular area going forward as well. And I'll just kind of close off the section before we go back. I think there's maybe a comment or two as it relates to implementation. And we certainly heard the importance of having a consistent approach to the requirements for heritage impact assessments and urban design, and making sure that those are required. So we've used the shall language, whereas I think the wording before was discretionary and used the sort of the may be required. So it shall be required again for applications that may impact cultural heritage. So again, refining some of the wording here based on a lot of the input that we've received to date. And again, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we do have a couple more questions.
Sure.
So we have a question here. Is there a process in place when a new build turns out not to be compatible with the neighboring homes?
So I really hope the intention here for new builds, and if that's a new home on a vacant lot, the policies and zoning now will establish specific guidance for those new builds in addition to the design and heritage guidelines. The new builds will be subject to site plan control. And so through that new build process, there will be an opportunity for the assessment and review in accordance with the design guidelines and the policies and provisions. So I think that's a very important change because currently those would go through the process and would be assessed, based on the current official plan policies and zoning. And now that's enhanced to include the lens around character and the importance of character on both the cultural heritage as well as those unique built form features. So that's sort of one of the main sort of, the impetus for this study and its implementation is to have that new land use planning framework within which the new development will be assessed. And that includes, as is referenced here, the heritage impact assessment, specifically looking at cultural heritage, and also urban design brief, which may be required, and that will be to assess all of those various elements of design.
Thanks, Dan. I have one here from regarding the potential additions to the Heritage Register. So I'll read the question. I can speak to this one as well. So question regarding character properties in one of your maps. I noticed that my house was identified as a property of potential interest, but I think this could be onerous, and I wasn't consulted in the process. To whom would I address this concern? So the property is being evaluated currently for the register, which is under Section 27 of the Ontario Heritage Act, is relatively minor impacts to heritage homeowners, as it's essentially a demolition control. It gives the municipality 60 days to evaluate your property to see if it's worthy of designation when a demolition permit is submitted. Under the Ontario Heritage Act, owner concurrence is not required. However, the owner is notified of this process, and the evaluation of how this is done is against the Ontario Regulation 906. And we evaluate under 3 categories. The first being design value and or physical value, the second being historic and associative value, and then the third being contextual value. And happy to discuss this further with the resident who posted the question. So you can always contact me. Again, it's Bianca Verrecchia, and I'm the Heritage Planner.
That's great. Thanks, Bianca.
Yeah, I can give you another one here. So in the new GB1 zone, why are you not including both sides of Betts Avenue in the legacy zoning when we are including both sides of Park? Betts Avenue and Victoria Terrace is a historic view and vista to the lake and the original location of the Lakeview Hotel, but this has not been identified as a recognized vista in the study. Being included in the new GB1 zone area, we could lose this vista with a dramatically larger home at 4 Betts Avenue. Both sides of the street should, in my opinion, be included in legacy zoning to protect this historic vista.
And I will just say excellent comment and input. We certainly highlighted that in terms of some of the comments we received on the online outreach and through the webinar. And that is definitely an area, as I mentioned, that we're looking at in terms of the additional views in Vistas and certainly the revisions to the zoning bylaw as well. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks, Dana. I'll do another one here. This resident spoke with Andrew Jeans at the Cultural Service Advisor for the Ontario Ministry of Tourism, and he advised that we need to discuss why the HUD was brought forth to us in 2017, and nothing transpired with regard to this thereafter. Whose idea was this to discuss the possibility of an HUD, and why has it changed to a secondary plan? I understand full and well that an HUD is a standalone bylaw and can exist with a secondary plan. Why aren't we discussing an HUD? Dan, I can speak to this one.
Sure.
So in 2017 is my understanding that planning staff did speak to the community about a heritage conservation district study. I'm not sure, I wasn't with the town at the time, so I can't speak to how much community buy-in there was. This is definitely, like we mentioned at the beginning of the session, this is something we can look at. However, the HCD study was not the direction from council. The direction from council was the land use planning study, and that's how we got to this study here. And then the HCD was included as an option, and maybe I'll pass it back to Dana for further into why we went with the secondary plan, but it was an option all along. So I'll pass it back to Dana if she wants to expand.
Sure, and I think it's important to note that I don't think anyone is saying that an HCD is not relevant and it shouldn't be something that's further considered. And in fact, we did identify it as something that can definitely be considered as the town is going forward. And one of the reasons for doing that in this process at sort of a bit of the later stage is establishing, from my experience in doing this work, establishing a solid land use planning framework, such as a secondary plan. Having that HCD come forward is certainly something that I've done in many municipalities, where the land use planning framework establishes those particular character areas. It starts to establish that framework for the cultural heritage. We know that there's been a considerable amount of work that has been done in the area related to that. So it's definitely something, and as we go forward, you'll see that we've highlighted the direction for that to potentially be included in the secondary plan. So it's not precluded at all. In fact, having the solid comprehensive land use framework is critically important to establishing that heritage conservation district plan. There's some really good examples of that I think we reflected in the examples in the approaches. Many of you are maybe more familiar than myself with some of those heritage matters, but certainly areas like Meadowvale Village in the city of Mississauga has a solid secondary plan with its HCD. The town of Oakville that I'm very familiar with has the livable Oakville plan in place with the downtown, and then the HCD was implemented following that land use planning framework. And certainly in an area like Port Dalhousie and St. Catharines, the secondary plan is then incorporating the HCD. So I want to make it clear that it's not something that in this study was sort of, precluded from coming forward. It was the recommendation for the approach to have the secondary plan comprehensively addressed and in place through this study process. So I hope that kind of alleviates some of the concern about moving forward with an HCD going forward. And I think, as Antonetta said too, that the town is, that has the benefit of that master plan for cultural heritage right now. So it is that additional lens and opportunity to consider that further as well.
Thanks, Dana. I do have another question. Someone's hand's up, so I'll do that one first, and then we have a few more in the Q&A. Hi, Nicole. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Thank you.
I can hear you.
So the HCD, which obviously there's a lot of people who want it. My understanding was that the reason that it wasn't proposed initially is that, then you get into a quagmire where you have all of these brightly painted houses that have all of these sort of non-heritage, orientation, you know what I mean, murals and things like that. So then all of that would potentially disappear. And I think as a community, people have to really think long and hard about whether they really want an HCD, because that's really what makes the community unique. It's the bright colors, it's the sailboats, it's the house that's painted like a piano, and then that would curb all of that. And that's what makes Grimsby Beach unique, is this meld of the old and the new. So I just wanted to point that out. And that was my understanding as to why they weren't going along the route of an HDC, because then we're jeopardizing that.
Yeah, I think, Nicole, if I can just respond to that, I think the two can work harmoniously, and that's what we've tried to establish at this stage. I'm not sure that you would lose that with an HCD, because depending on how an HCD is structured, it can sort of reference that as it's been established in sort of the secondary plan policies. But I also think it's fair to say that we did receive, and it's documented that there was hesitation around an HCD from comments from the community about the concerns that it be, as you say, too prescriptive, and sort of another layer of requirement in terms of permits and the implications of that and the process. So I do know that there were some, if not many, concerns raised in relation to how it would apply and what that would mean for, as you say, some of the unique changes that people were seeking. So I think it's a combination of things, but again, it's not to say that it can't work with the secondary plan and be considered further.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dana. I believe this question is further to the one regarding compatible housing, compatible new housing. Say a new house was built, and then how that process would go if it didn't fit in with the character of the neighborhood. I think this is further to that. So the reason I ask is this has been my personal experience that the actual built form and massing is not recognized until after approval.
Interesting. And again, that's a good point, because in some cases, depending on the nature of the policies and the provisions that are guiding the assessment of that change, it may not specifically require those features to be considered. So that's why we're adding in all those elements and characteristics to be considered as part of the assessment of compatibility.
Thanks, Dana. I have another one here. I am wondering why the east side of Park is included in the core and the west side of Betts is not included.
So I believe the east side was, as a result, again, early on, through input on the walking tour and through our stakeholder advisory committee about enhancing and expanding the study area. And then I think the reference was the west side of Betts, which I think is included.
Yeah, I think it's in, I don't know if it's in reference maybe potentially to the secondary, the GB1 zone. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And as I noted, we've highlighted that, and we're certainly looking at potential refinements or changes to that. So thank you for that.
Great. So how were the character areas established? The northwest character area was houses, home/built heritage that are approximately the same age as those in the core area that were an important part of the Methodist era, and as an access from the core by Spoony Bridge. Why would this not be covered by the same guidelines as those in the core section? Example 6.3.
So thank you for that question. And maybe that leads into a little bit of the narrative or context in the next area, which is the northwest area. And then I can kind of respond to that question while going through these policies. So in terms of describing the characteristics of that area, absolutely. This northwest area was part of that 1885 plan, the Grimsby Park New Survey. And so what's interesting about this area, and really the differentiating factor, is more of sort of the grid-like pattern of the streets with a range of lots and lot sizes, but really a number of the streets which are those sort of through streets to the lake. In this area, we also undertook an assessment of all the existing lot areas and lot frontages. And certainly in this area, we saw larger lot frontages and lot areas, and in some cases, newer homes that have been built and replacing some of the older homes. Although there are some of the existing original homes that have been sort of renovated and enhanced in that area as well. So most of the change that has actually occurred within the area has occurred in the Northwest. And certainly redevelopment in this area is something that we wanted, again, to make sure is established in accordance with appropriate provisions. So that's why you sort of see the new zoning established for this area and as well as the south area. So I hope that explains sort of the differentiation. There are some, obviously there's common characteristics throughout all of the areas, but the Northwest area in particularly, predominantly the lots that are also adjacent to the shoreline is an important factor, and the orientation of the streets. So we've set out policies in this section as it relates to, again, land use, reflecting that character, and also the importance of this particular area as it relates to environmental protection and the importance of protecting the shoreline and reducing erosion. In terms of urban design and cultural heritage and implementation, very similar policies to the core, certainly ensuring that heritage attributes are protected and that the design guidelines are considered. And then in terms of implementation, now reflecting the new zoning, and that the minimum lot areas and frontages be maintained in accordance with that zoning bylaw. And also in terms of this particular area, given its proximity, and this was at the request of the region in terms of the treatment plant and in terms of any land use compatibility assessment as it relates to noise and air quality or odor. And that's a standard condition that we've added into this area in the south area. And then finally, those elements of the urban design brief, very similar to the core, that need to be addressed in this particular area. So I hope that kind of responds to the distinction in the Northwest area. Again, some common characteristics, but predominantly the adjacency of the shoreline, as well as the nature of the street pattern.
Thanks, Dana. I have a few more. So to add to the comment about expanding the core designation to both sides of Betts in order to protect the vista, is there also a woodlot sandwiched? There is also a woodlot sandwich between Birch Park and Betts that also need to be protected. So I can note this comment. And I don't know if you wanted to expand on anything.
Yeah, and I believe it is. And unfortunately, again, all the schedules are at the end. But I think when we look to those, there are some overlay areas for environmental protection that run through that area that you're just referring to.
Thanks, Dana. So what about the homes that are within the historic heritage area that are not historic or heritage value? Do these homeowners still have to abide by the rules of the heritage zone? So I'm not sure if this is in reference to the HCD or if this is in reference to the policies within the secondary plan.
Yeah, I think it may be referring to the zoning bylaw, and maybe we can come back to it. I think it's asking if you do have a home that's maybe not listed or designated in the core, if it's subject to that legacy zoning, and the answer to that would be yes. And I can certainly speak to that when we come to the zoning bylaw.
Thanks, Dana. I have another question here. If a heritage conservation district plan for Grimsby Beach can be layered over top of the proposed secondary plan, will that HCD plan prevail over the secondary plan, or will the secondary plan prevail over the HCD?
So they're two different pieces of legislation. It's not layered over. It's actually a separate document that's approved under the Heritage Act. And so it would be defined as a Part 5 designation under the Heritage Act as a heritage conservation district. So it sort of fits under a different area, but it is intended to be complementary with the secondary plan, and the secondary plan would actually refer to it, and it would refer to specific sections and policies that would also be in place. And so it would have more details in relation to specific design features and streetscape features, especially as it relates to the cultural heritage resources. But it would also talk about aspects of heritage impact. So I don't want to say that it's an overlay, and it's also not a sort of a complementary. It's actually a separate legislated plan, but under a different act. So it again, the importance of having it go forward when a secondary plan or a land use planning framework comprehensively is in place. It's kind of identified the characteristics. It can provide that much more detail as it relates to the cultural heritage attributes.
Okay, Dana, I'm going to read the next question.
Okay.
To Bianca's comment about not knowing if the residents wanted an HCD in 2016. This is pulled directly from the planning staff created minutes of the time. From March 2016 Heritage Meeting Minutes, Grimsby Beach information session. It was discussed that the information session at the Grimsby Beach drew approximately 80 people and was a successful evening. It was noted that the evening was successful at providing information to the community and that Alderman Berry, Alderman Cadwell, and Alderman Wilson were in attendance. The feedback from the event has been positive so far, with residents identifying a desire to form a community group and further explore the idea of implementing an HCD or CIP or both. A follow-up to the evening will be planned once more feedback in the community is received. I'm just going to continue reading. She says from April 5th, 2016, it was noted that the feedback is coming in as all positive, and there appears to be an interest in forming a stakeholder group to explore the creation of an HCD or CIP for Grimsby Beach. So I just want to jump in and say, thank you for that background, Kate. I think that was 2016, certainly in all the engagement we did in the last 14 months, the HCD was not as favorable. And that said, we've been very clear. This is not saying an HCD can't come at some point in the future. We're hoping that the community can spend their time with us tonight, as they have been, improving what we have in front of us so that we can bring forward a secondary plan that's meaningful and that addresses all the concerns. So I don't know if we need to add anything to that. I'm not sure there's any point debating what happened in 2016. There's certainly been a change in council. There's been a change in leadership. There's been, most of the staff here tonight has not been around since then. And again, we listened very closely to this community. They had the option of voting on an HCD right now. And whatever we're doing now does not preclude an HCD in the future. In fact, the report also suggests it could be a tool used in the future. So I'd encourage the community to spend their time on making this the best document that it could be. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything further to that. Jan,
Okay.
are you okay?
Yeah, no, thanks, Antoinette, and I appreciate the concern and certainly the passion from some of the community members, and again, that's balanced with a lot of input that we received with people being concerned about the possible impacts, and certainly hearing now that there's voices that are raising this and looking to it as being the an approach that should be further considered. We appreciate that, and certainly, as we've noted, it's not something that would be precluded, and in fact, I think it would only be enhanced by having this comprehensive plan in place at the start. So I'm not sure if there's any other comments. I'm a little cautious of people's time. I don't want to rush. I certainly appreciate all of the input we're receiving tonight. I think it's a great way to go. I know it's tedious, but it is a great way to go through and have sort of the interaction with the comments and questions as we go. So we kind of worked our way through the Northwest area, and I was just going to sort of maybe just go through the South area because we do have some other sections of the plan to go through, and they may not have as much interest. And certainly this is sort of the most important part, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of establishing these character areas. So the third character area, again, this part of the secondary plan sets out sort of the narrative about a description. And again, it references, that historic development and subdivision that was developed. And again, a range of characteristics and styles in this particular area, sort of a range of lot sizes. In this area, of course, we have the school, we have the designated tree stand area and the picnic area. Certainly some important features and elements, including sort of that gateway feature. So some very distinctive features that define the character of the south area, including the large woodlot area, which on the designation is protected. So in terms of land use, again, noting the importance of the characteristics of this area, the environmental conservation area being protected. We should probably highlight that even though this area isn't adjacent to the shoreline, because that environmental area runs through this area, it's important to note its importance as it may relate to the shoreline and erosion. Urban design and cultural heritage, again, this area is one where we've specifically highlighted improvements to the public realm. And this relates to that gateway feature that I mentioned, the importance of signage and visibility around the tree stand in Grand Avenue Park, a future expansion of Grand Avenue Park. Should the beach hall be removed and relocated? We heard that quite clearly through the community comments, that would be an excellent way to sort of integrate that particular area and enhance the use of that particular facility, and creating really a community focal point, sort of that clustering of the school, the park, and maybe some existing and future trail connections through that area. And that's where we're also identifying the importance of that public realm master plan for Grimsby Beach. So again, implementation, referencing some of the similar references to implementation in terms of zoning and the assessment and the urban design brief. And in this particular case, referencing the importance again of the various characteristics, as well as tree preservation and enhancement. So I'll just pause there because I know now we have a number of sort of sections as we go through that kind of relate generally to some of the more functional policies. So if there's no questions or comments, I'll keep going.
There are some open questions.
Okay.
Site plan approval for single detached development is delegated to planning staff. Will staff decide if the development is in accordance with the urban design guidelines? And if an HA or urban design brief is required, will staff review, analyze HA and urban design reports for all new built, rebuilt single home applications in Grimsby Beach be brought forward to Heritage Grimsby Advisory Committee or Committee of the Whole for review or posted on the town's planning applications website? How will the community know if a new home application has been reviewed against the secondary plan urban design guidelines, HIA, and is there any ability for public input or comment?
So that's a lot to unpack, and it relates to town process. So I would defer to the town, but I would say that certainly there is a definite role for planning staff, design staff, and cultural heritage staff through those applications. And so yes, staff would be reviewing those, and the site plan process as it currently exists, I believe the reference was delegation. And I'm not sure, I apologize, I'm not sure in terms of the information and how that's provided for in terms of applications. I know in some communities, site plan applications are listed and noted with the plans. And I'm just not sure at the town if that's currently a practice or not.
Okay. And I just want to add, I think if we're asking for a heritage impact assessment, if it's a heritage property, then it makes sense that it would, or adjacent to a heritage property, then as per it happens right now, those would all come to the Heritage Grimsby Advisory Committee. But as you said, Dana, that's a bit more process related, and we can develop some Q&A pieces for those. Next question, who approves compatibility? Is there somewhere I can get more information on the whole process of building approvals in general? I would recommend that you email planning@grimsby.ca and we'll do our best to answer your questions. But since it's not specific to this piece, I'll move on. The consultant has noted that the matter of the deeming bylaw has been added as an additional process. The MHBC planning report at page 42 and 43 is suggestive that the old historic plans are valid. One, what due diligence with the land registry office has been performed to ascertain whether these old plans, such as the Township Plan 45, are legal and valid? Two, if this has not yet been conducted because of the fundamental nature of this issue to the area and any secondary plan, will this issue be determined before the proposed plan is put before council?
So I can answer the question in terms of those particular plans in terms of validity. There have been a number of deeming bylaws that have been applied and approved. And so in terms of expanding upon the areas that could be under a deeming bylaw, that's, I think, the context of validity. I will say that it is certainly something that we have not pursued further. It was not part of the scope of the study. It is something we recommended, and it would require consideration in terms of assessment, some survey work, and some assessment through the legal department in relation to preparing such a bylaw. So there is additional process involved, but it is certainly something we have suggested could be further considered.
Okay. Last question in the Q&A is just wondering why the 3 houses on the west side of Grand Avenue is included in this. 2, 4, and 6 Grand Avenue.
Again, I believe those properties were included in the original study area, but we can note that and confirm that. But I do believe those properties were within the original study area.
Okay. And that's all for the Q&A in the chat.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to go through some of the functional policies, and I'm just really going to highlight. I apologize. I'm going to go through them and maybe then just pause at the end for questions so we can get through them and spend a little bit of time on the zoning bylaw as well. So the functional policies cover areas of servicing, and as was noted, part of the study involved a servicing assessment through Crozier Engineering that looked at water, wastewater, and stormwater management, as well as the next section, which deals with transportation. And as a result of that work, there are some specific policies that have been identified with some requirements as if new homes and new development proceeds, some issues in areas that would need to be considered. So I think our main note here was that we referenced the infrastructure plan, which is one of the implementation tools, and we referenced that directly in the secondary plan. Certainly, as it relates to servicing and transportation, identifying some improvements that were noted in the study, and included in that are the elements of signage as well. So those are noted here in these specific policies. Natural heritage, again, this is a reflection of most of the existing policies, but specifically highlighting those features and elements of natural heritage within Grimsby Beach and the importance of those. So that's identifying the natural features and buffer areas as they're mapped, and that no new development or site alteration be undertaken in those shoreline and hazard lands, recognizing the significant woodlands and that designated environmental protection and conservation area being protected, and ensuring that there are adequate setbacks and buffers to those features, and also ensuring that measures are introduced to reduce soil erosion and siltation and the importance of erosion and sediment control, and then future environmental work be undertaken as it relates to the shoreline protection area and the ensuring appropriate mitigation. Tree protection and really tree enhancement as well. And we might want to, again, address that particular title. I know we had some comments about that. Trees certainly were one of the key areas of input that we got, with some excellent supportive information from the community. And I really thank the community members who provided that information through the study. Some of our tree inventory work was really enhanced by the additional work done by the community itself. So trees clearly defined as a distinctive characteristic within Grimsby Beach. And a key objective is not only preserving the existing trees, but looking at enhancement to the tree canopy wherever possible, and with any form of change that's coming forward. The importance of protecting those significant woodlot areas, the importance of maintaining and protecting the cultural heritage significance of the grand old white oak tree stand, and also an overall tree strategy being developed. And it says shall be developed, and we've actually with the community's input and assistance, developed one with a number of programs and resources that can be available. So if and when that is put forward, if it goes with the secondary plan, it's one of those areas that we've actually already incorporated. And then a further tree management plan specific to Grimsby Beach be undertaken, and that's actually outlined in the tree strategy. So all of that is sort of captured in these particular policies. Next is the parks, open spaces, and trails. And again, the importance of those features and listing and identifying those features. And we had some great input from our stakeholder advisory committee and enhancing some of those areas as they're described here and how they're described in the planning document as well. Talking about the importance of those public areas, the signage and wayfinding, which we know has been specifically identified as something to pursue further. Enhancing park areas with tree planting, again, aligned with the tree planting program to make sure that it's appropriate, the trees are appropriate in terms of species and location. Really opening up and enhancing those public areas. And again, the final comment here is, or policy here is in relation to that public realm master plan, which is really to be developed to provide that strategic direction for all of these elements within the public realm, those trails, access areas, and all publicly accessible areas. The policies in relation to cultural heritage and urban design are sort of the last set of functional policies. These are the general policies that apply. They're sort of in addition to all of the specific cultural heritage and urban design policies within each of the character areas. And it really is sort of reiterating the importance of those cultural heritage attributes within Grimsby Beach, the intention to continue to promote and conserve and protect those areas and those opportunities, ensuring that those that historic lotting pattern and street patterns are maintained and protected. Again, making sure these are reflected in the urban design and heritage guidelines. Views and vistas, I've highlighted this because, again, I know that there's been quite a number of comments about enhancing those areas as they're defined and as they're illustrated in both the schedule and in the guidelines. And then again, a number of comments as it relates to the various pieces of legislation that prescribe cultural heritage, referencing those in terms of conservation of historic places, as well as the Ontario Heritage Act, and also the need for archaeological assessments because of the proximity to the shoreline and those cultural, heritage impact assessments. And again, we flagged these particular areas because we know that there have been comments and a discussion around the Heritage Conservation District. And I think, it's clear that we need to add policies here in relation to the community's desire to really proceed with some continuation of considering Heritage Conservation District. And if that is considered to be added into the policy, this would be the location to put that in. And then finally, urban design is providing some overall design objectives as it relates to built form design, as it relates to connectivity, some of the key design priority areas and gateways. And really, this is where we may want to highlight some of those unique features as they are also expressed in the design guidelines. And that would be some of those really unique features, built form and design, as was referenced earlier, I believe in the core section, and that's those unique murals and paint colors and design elements that may not fall under the cultural heritage significant features, but certainly are character features that are important for considerations in design. So I'll pause there because before I do that, I'm going into sort of the last section, which is really implementation, which is pulling forward a number of policies that are really in the official plan and setting them out in detail here about process. So before I do that, I'll just turn if there's any comments or questions.
Yeah, we have 3 questions and then a hand up. So I'll start with the questions. What is the rationale of Crozier Engineering recommending moving water service to homes on Victoria Terrace west of 3rd Street from the lake shore, north of those homes to the south side along Temple Lane? Wouldn't it be a better use of public money to leave the existing water service in place and to protect them by protecting the shoreline?
So on that particular element, I know this came up through comments from Public Works and also identifying the fact that there is, I believe, the servicing to the rear of those lots when the preference is to have that within the public right of way. So I believe it was raised to identify if and when that change should be considered, and it's set out in the infrastructure plan. Again, it's a recommendation. And again, it would have to be assessed and considered if and when that was appropriate as part of an upgrade the town may otherwise be doing. So I don't think the intention is to go in and do that right away, but it's identified as an issue that was flagged by Public Works that should be considered.
Okay, next question. It seems like the tree strategy and parks, etc., are somewhat vague. If this bylaw passes, how do we ensure that these important matters are implemented as well?
So that's a great question. And the policies here are very general. The tree strategy itself does set out some detail as it relates to tree protection, tree planting, and goes into a little bit of detail about different approaches. It also includes the tree inventory work, as I mentioned, that had been done by Trandis and also provided by community members. And so it is intended to outline all the various strategies, programs, and tools that are available. And it does make some reference to those that may be the most appropriate for Grimsby Beach. And it's done so somewhat intentionally because the direction that goes forward may be for a larger area than just Grimsby Beach to be part of a tree protection or tree enhancement program. And certainly the tree management plan would be very specific to Grimsby Beach and be implemented separately. So there's a number of different elements at play, and those are hopefully generally set out here in the policies, but intended to be a little broader in the tree strategy and then to be more refined through that tree management plan that goes forward. And I think one of the things we emphasize is the importance of that tree management plan to be developed and undertaken as soon as possible.
I'll add, Dana, to your point that we've shared the tree strategy with the Grimsby Green Committee, and that committee is also talking, I think, about a wider town strategy. So I think that answers also the question about will the town implement a tree bylaw for the entire town first. So last question in the Q&A, and then again, we have a hand up. Defining public and private areas is important. There are lots owned by individuals who have been dead for 60 plus years. Who is responsible for searching the title and responsibility for these lots?
So again, excellent question. I think it goes back to an earlier comment that I think one of the community members made about access and right-of-ways and encroachments. As I mentioned earlier, it is something a little bit outside of the realm and the scope of the study, but definitely something that we flagged and noted that the town needs to consider in terms of publicly accessible areas, and looking at those encroachments that are in place and looking at how to address some of those in a process going forward. So it's an important comment and an important element that needs to be further considered. Some of that will be addressed through that public realm master plan, but I think there's additional elements that would need to be addressed outside of that we've noted for the town to consider.
Okay, and then finally, hand up by Nicole Patterson.
I have a lot of questions tonight. I just have two comments and one question. So in regards to the tree protection plan, I just wanted to note that along Victoria Terrace, in the fall, when those walnuts fall, they pack a heavy punch. And in fact, when I've gardened, I've actually had to wear my bicycle helmet, and we can't even sit on our deck because it's too dangerous. And then the entire laneway going down to the beach is it's treacherous, and we've actually seen people who have sprained their ankles and fallen. And I just think that it's great to promote tree protection, but they also need to address the hazards. And then there was a bit about adding lights to Bell Park. And there's quite a few homes that surround Bell Park, and noise pollution is obviously a concern. We've got the Gardner, which is really loud at times, but light pollution needs to be addressed also. And there's a lot of scientific studies that say that 100% darkness is inherent to health and wellness. And then in terms, somebody mentioned the bit about the vacant lots. So lot 35 and 37 on Victoria Terrace, there's a huge lot that really has been vacant forever, and obviously no tax has been paid on it for I don't know how many years. But when you go down to the beach and you look at the property, the shoreline is just caving in. And I'm just wondering how quickly the town is going to address this issue, not only for all of the houses that are along Victoria Terrace there, but also in the other direction of Victoria Terrace and right up to 3rd Street. I mean, we've seen what's happened in Vancouver, and I think that this is such a pressing issue with shoreline protection, and I'm just wondering why the town, or what the town's plan is to address that immediately before it becomes a disaster.
So maybe I'll let Antonetta answer the last question, but I can quickly just respond and appreciate the comments, Nicole, about kind of the condition of trees. And definitely in the tree strategy, we note the importance of conditions and maintenance. And so that would include, ensuring that those issues of maintenance, and in some cases, some of the tree maintenance and pruning that's required to address some of those concerns and impacts is addressed. So that is set out to some degree in the tree strategy in terms of the comprehensive approach. And then in relation to lighting, I think that's a really important element in some of the areas in terms of looking at enhancements, making sure that that lighting is appropriately designed and that it's the type of sort of night sky friendly, full shield cutoff that doesn't create those impacts. And definitely that would be something that would be considered. So I'll turn it to Antonetta to talk about the last issue you raised.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. So throughout the duration of this project, we've also had a technical advisory committee formed of town staff and public works, parks and rec, et cetera. They're all key people on that team. So we can raise this again with them to see when it's forecasted in their capital projects. And certainly if you wanted to write us an email, we can flip it to them and hopefully get a more concrete answer for you quickly. But I know they are aware of it. They've been involved in the study, and I just don't know when it's forecasted in the capital plans, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Well, actually, Antonetta, there's a rumor that's going on around saying that the town is willing to deem those public properties, or the properties that are vacant, to the adjacent lot owners. Is that something that's really truly happening? I mean, I personally don't care. I care about the shoreline protection, just out of curiosity.
I don't have an answer or more information on that question, but again, if you wanted to put that in an email, I could flip it to the appropriate people for you and get an answer. I see Kate has her hand up, but before that, we also had 3 questions come in the chat. So why don't I do the 3 questions and then we can go over to Kate. Through this study and at the beginning of this chat, we talked about the infrastructure being an area of concern. Can you expand on this and let us know what improvements, upgrades to the infrastructure you are hoping to make?
So that's an excellent question. And one of the key components was the infrastructure plan. So there was an assessment that was done, as I mentioned, of water, wastewater, and stormwater management. And so through that process, there was an identification of some areas of improvement that should be considered by the town. And that would be part of more general works programs and improvements in the area and the surrounding area. And one of those concerns was related to sort of quality and quantity control. And as Antonetta mentioned, the Conservation Authority were part of that technical advisory committee, and they too had noted some of the concerns around stormwater management controls to some of the sort of uncontrolled areas. So that would be something that would be incorporated as is set out in the fiscal impact study that was provided with the infrastructure plan in terms of addressing that and incorporating that into future works by the town.
Thanks. Next question. In addition to Bob Friesen's question about defining public and private areas being important and who is actually responsible for searching the title and responsibility for these lots, I want to urge the town to acquire this parcel and add it to the VT Waterfront Park area. This should not be a missed opportunity to extend our public waterfront, as it is one of the town's strategic objectives of council to acquire waterfront. Okay, I think we can make a note of that. Next question, are these provisions for the residents, or is this in order to keep the tourists coming? There is a huge problem with tourist invasion. How and when will this be addressed?
So I will note that tourism as a sort of an activity, and certainly one I know that was raised in relation to significant concerns by existing residents. There's a certain extent to which the land use policies or land use planning under the Planning Act can address sort of those operational matters in terms of who comes in and out of the area. It's certainly something that we identified that some aspects of wayfinding and signage could address, and we've incorporated some of that where we can into these policies. But a lot of that is really in relation to sort of public relations and communications by the town. And I know through the process, the town were very responsive, I think, to some of the concerns and issues as those issues arise. So I'll sort of defer to town staff on that, but there are, in reality, some limitations as to how the sort of the land use planning framework, which really addresses, place, buildings, and structures, can address those operational matters in the public areas.
Yeah, Dan, I'll just build on that. We tried to be as responsive as we could with our colleagues in various other departments, including Park, Recs, and Culture. We had more bylaw presence over the summer and really tried to respond to some of the needs, perhaps even amplified by COVID. But I think there was also another Grimsby Beach resident survey about some of the tourism issues and what it was causing. And I think those are being handled by Parks, Recreation, and Culture. But again, certainly happy for you to send in an email and we can get you a more definitive response from the team that is tackling that more specifically. Okay, so that's it for Q&A, but we have a hand up. So that's Kate. Kate?
Hi, Kate, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay.
I just want to go back to a question that Nicole made, and also referencing the shoreline, and also the possible suggested through the consultant removal of the infrastructure along the shoreline behind the houses west of 3rd Street. And it's more of a question because I know that there's been communication with residents that own houses along there about encouraging them to shore up their own properties at the lake. And then it sounds like during this presentation that it sounds like the town or it's being recommended that we as a town take more of an active role in the process of shoring that up. And I recall being at a town meeting once when we were talking about the cost of shoring up the end of like 7th and 8th and 9th Street, and it being mentioned at the town meeting that the town is responsible to protect its infrastructure, and that is why we shored up all the ends of these roads. So my question to you is, A, are we suggesting that we remove this infrastructure behind these houses along the shore so that the town's no longer obligated to shore up the shores? Or should we already be doing it since we've already done it to the other streets? Or are we actually going to, as a town, protect these shorelines? And should we be communicating with the owners of those houses who are already in the process of trying to find the money to do it themselves? That's the question.
So it's a great question, Kate, and I think what it does is raises the fact that there are issues on public and private land as it relates to the servicing and the shoreline protection. And I know through our discussions with the Technical Advisory Committee that they do have a program as it relates, as you mentioned, to the protection of some of the infrastructure on some of the streets in sort of the northwest area as well. And that's an ongoing program. And I know through the matters that were raised through Crozier's assessment, again, Public Works identified this additional servicing that should be considered going forward. So I know it's something that is highlighted. The how and the when and the who is probably something that would go forward as part of Public Works program. But in terms of the shoreline, I think it's twofold. It's definitely ensuring that those areas are protected, definitely where they're in public ownership, and even when they're in private ownership in terms of hazard lands. So they are identified as hazard lands, and we know that there is areas and improvements that can be made, and some of that is through education, and some of that may be through additional programs. So at this point, it's sort of going forward with what the town has in place for those areas, and there may be additional specific elements of those programs to specifically address the shoreline. Some of the areas that were assessed didn't note significant concern, but there were some areas that were identified in the Trandis report that should be further assessed. So again, that's something that was part of the recommendation. So I think it's in response, it's really going forward. I don't think we're suggesting that, that infrastructure or those changes be made right away, but it's identifying that there's issues related to that, and that should be further addressed by Public Works.
Yeah, Dan, I'd like to maybe echo that, but also just say I wouldn't take away from this meeting, like Kate might be, that the town might be doing it on private property. I think they answered where they had a road or an end of the road and a right of way there, that they've took care of public infrastructure, but not private. Again, to Dana's point, though, this should be something that's dealt with by Public Works, and they can tell you a bit more about those plans, and happy to facilitate that information for you. Okay, Dana, well, hang on, I think something else popped up in the Q&A now.
Okay. I was just going to say, I'm just conscious of time. I'm hoping people can stay on because we haven't even gotten to the zoning bylaw, and maybe if we can all agree to spend a little bit more time, we can sort of just get through that.
And you know what, the next questions are about lot coverage and things like that. So why don't we deal with the zoning bylaw and maybe proactively answer some of these questions.
Okay. So really quickly, and it's a nice lead into zoning, the final section of the secondary plan deals with implementation. So it's the place that references what are all the implementation tools and requirements and guidelines and bylaws that also specifically will apply to Grimsby Beach. So in this section, you'll see the reference to the urban design and heritage guidelines. You'll see the reference to how applications will be assessed and what the requirements will be. And so that's important because applications coming in, it kind of gives a scope of work that's required, a terms of reference, you may call it, that sets out what all those requirements could be. So there's certainty around what may be required for someone coming forward with some application for change. And again, the study requirements will be scoped depending on the types of applications. All development approvals are required to address, all of the matters that are set out in this section. And then we get to the section that deals with those additional tools. So that includes the zoning bylaw. So this is a section that sets out the requirements for zoning. And it's really important here that we note the importance of the zoning bylaw as it would relate to, I think one of the earlier questions was minor variances. And again, policies here that specifically identify that when consideration is being given to minor variance, additional policies that have to be considered. So that's definitely, in our opinion, an enhancement to the policies when minor variances are being brought forward. And then finally, the application of site plan being in place for development in Grimsby Beach, and talking about some of the requirements for that process, and certainly agreements that may be in place and what those can address. And finally, policies very specific to lot creation and vacant lots, setting out the requirements for those applications, and also certain studies and requirements that have to accompany those applications, and sort of the tests for those applications. And we've highlighted the existing vacant lots. We've had a lot of comments tonight about vacant lots, had a lot of concerns raised about vacant lots and how they would be addressed. And certainly we've included a section here, and again, subject to maybe considering transition provisions here and the deeming bylaw, adding some additional refined language. So that actually gets us through the secondary plan. I know there's a couple of schedules that illustrate, I don't know, Terry, if you wanted to go through those. There are a number of schedules to the secondary plan. I can just speak to them quickly. Again, it's the map of the area. There is, oh, she's bringing them up. So that's great. So there are a number of schedules, and these are read in conjunction with the policy. So this is that land use schedule. The character areas are well defined. And again, I think we highlight that and this one, which is the views and vistas. Those are two of the schedules that, based on the comments tonight and some previous comments, we're going to go back and look at making refinements to ensure that we've captured some of the concerns about the boundaries of those areas. And certainly, as we mentioned, the views, making sure that those are all identified, and as they not only come out from Grimsby Beach, but also views in and along some of the key areas. And these are technical amendments to sort of identify the area that applies. And that would be to the parent plan. And again, this is identifying the secondary plan area and the sort of the black dotted line. And again, secondary plans are identified, and this would be the one that sort of highlights that. So these are technical schedules to the amendment. So I went through that very, very quickly, but I think it's good just to know that it's not just the policies, it's also the added schedules that would be in place.
Should I just show the schedule for the zoning bylaw? I have it up here, right?
Sure, that's great. So this is actually good because it illustrates the area of the zoning bylaw that would be changed. And I'm going to come back to talk about the zoning bylaw in a little bit of detail as it's structured. So you can see that this generally applies right now to the northwest area and the south area. And I think, as we've heard tonight, we'll look at that boundary, because we did have the concerns raised about that, and the inclusion of that area perhaps into the existing, or maintaining that in the existing GB zone. So this is the schedule that goes along with the zoning bylaw. And maybe what I'll do, Terry, just really quickly, and maybe we don't have to go back to the presentation. I can certainly speak to it. Before we go into the zoning bylaw, I just wanted to note that in addition to the secondary plan, we're introducing a draft zoning bylaw. So that zoning bylaw was actually developed as part of the background analysis and the work that we did. We took a look at the areas, the characteristics, and we looked at the characteristics in terms of setting out zoning provisions. And a draft zoning bylaw was actually developed to start to identify the area as it's known as sort of the legacy zoning around sort of the core area and maintaining that, but also starting to think about those other areas of Grimsby Beach that perhaps existing zone provisions could be applied so that they would be set up in a way that they're reflective of the characteristics in terms of lot area, lot frontage, and some of the other provisions as they relate to things like setbacks, height, and coverage. And so we certainly looked at the surrounding residential areas and looked at the various characteristics of both the northwest and south areas to look at the built form and look at the existing conditions in terms of setbacks, and making sure that, you know, the homes that were identified in those areas would fall within these zoning provisions and would be reflective of these provisions, as they would sort of control the character and the built form in those areas. So that's what this Grimsby Beach 1 zone intends to do. It's slightly different, obviously, than the Grimsby Beach zone. It includes provisions that are very similar to those stable, mature residential areas to the west and along the shoreline as well. And it's, as I mentioned, very reflective of the existing lot areas and frontages in the areas they exist today. The majority of the other provisions that would apply to things like garages, accessory structures would continue to apply as they're set out in the parent bylaw, as well as provisions for parking. So there would not be any significant changes to the bylaw in that respect. And again, any changes to these provisions would be required to be considered through an application for minor variance, which is available. But again, that change would now be required to be assessed in accordance with the new policies, the lens of the design and heritage guidelines, and the additional policies would be required to address those cultural heritage and design characteristics. I will say, in addition to the new zone, we did add an additional provision identifying a lot coverage provision. And this is something, again, that we should probably consider to a certain extent in terms of transition regulations, to ensure that if there are applications that have been in process that this particular provision may affect, we can consider that. And then in terms of the Grimsby Beach 1 zone, we did have some comments suggesting that perhaps the coverage is a bit low, and perhaps it could be a little bit higher, given some of the properties do have coverage that is larger than the 25%. So that certainly something we'll take back. We did look at average coverage and found that this 25% was appropriate for the majority of homes, but we can certainly go back and relook at that and any specific consideration. So we appreciate the comments on that. I think the main concern that came forward with zoning is that the legacy zoning as it applies certainly would be maintained, and that is to require someone that's coming forward perhaps with a revision or a change that's greater than the percentage that's otherwise permitted, or a new home on a vacant lot. That's sort of where the provisions are a bit odd, in that the provisions apply as to the existing buildings and structures. And of course, with a vacant lot, you don't have any provisions for setbacks or coverage. So that is one of the reasons we've added in a provision for coverage, so that going forward with a vacant lot, that would be one of the provisions or standards that's set. So I'll pause there on the zoning bylaw. I think our last section tonight was to talk just very briefly about the urban design and heritage guidelines. But I'll pause there if there's any questions or comments on the zoning bylaw. And I know we've flagged a couple, and certainly look for any additional comments.
Okay, question. I was also thinking of the 25% lot coverage. I went through some other townships for some context of proposed lot coverage and setbacks. The closest townships to ours that I can think of is Port Dalhousie, and their lot coverage is 45%. This seems to be a more common lot coverage to other townships as well. It also seems to be more in line with the Ontario Building Board. I'm wondering why the town lot coverage is proposed to be so small, especially lots are already small here, especially because lots are already small here.
It's an excellent question, and again, it's flagged. We looked at, because the many of the homes do have much larger lot coverage as they exist today on some of the smaller lots, but there are also some larger lots. And again, with the legacy zoning, that would require basically the building footprint creates that coverage. So this is really intended to apply to vacant lots, and our concern was having a number that is too high may not be reflective of the character, and maintaining a lower lot coverage assures that where the development is proportional to the lot, Again, the change can be sought to through the minor variance process, but certainly putting in place a coverage that would be proportional to the lot size and reflective of an appropriate coverage proportionally was something that we thought was appropriate for the area.
So Dana, I think that answers the next question, but I'll read it out just for diligence.
Okay.
In addition, with a small lot coverage, you may get tiny homes built taller as opposed to more normal sized homes that suit the area. Would a larger lot coverage percentage be considered like 40% or 50%? So unless you wanted to add anything further, I think you kind of covered.
Yeah, and I would add that the height provisions that are in place would continue to be in place for the zone.
And that's a good segue. This next question is about height. The GB legacy zoning basically remains the same. Why is the height staying at 9 meters high when this height will not be compatible with the heights of most of the surrounding homes in the core?
So again, a great point. We can go back and look at that. But again, in terms of an assessment of height, there is quite a range of heights within the area, and that provides some flexibility, but also maintains some compatibility with some of the existing homes. But it's certainly something that we can look at further. Our average heights were showing in and around, quite a range in this area. And again, that's the existing height in the bylaw. So we weren't intending to make changes to that at this point. But it's certainly an area we can flag and look further.
Okay. Is the average actual height of the homes in Grimsby Beach 9 meters, 30 feet in height?
So I will go back and look. I know in the planning report, there is a summary, a detailed summary of the characteristics in each of the areas. So I'll have to go back and look at what that is. I don't believe the average is 9, but again, that is the existing provision in the bylaw. So again, we'll flag that. We'll go back and look at that.
Okay. And then there's a hand up from Kate in the chat.
Hi, Kate, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, but I just forgot to put my hand down.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, let's see. I think I see something else in the Q&A now. Just a comment, it should be imperative that individual designation be implemented for Auditorium Circle, Victoria Terrace, the pier and the beach, the woodlot, and the old athletic field behind the Grand Avenue School to protect the cultural heritage value and their importance as green space.
Great comment.
Yeah, good comment. I think Bianca's on that, so that's wonderful. Thank you. Okay.
So I think the last piece, and maybe I can go back to sharing my screen because it was the Urban Design and Heritage Guidelines, if that's okay. And I'll get that up. So hopefully everyone can see that. So as was mentioned early in the presentation, there are a number of implementation tools that were actually drafted and created to accompany the secondary plan. And those included the tree strategy, the urban design and heritage guidelines, and the infrastructure plan, and then the additional tools that will be continued in terms of additional work. But it's important to note with the draft urban design heritage guidelines, we have received a number of comments on these, really helpful input on some of the guidance that's provided, and we heard some of that tonight. It's really a document that's intended to provide that direction and guidance with respect to two things, the public and the private realm. So as it relates to sort of the public realm, it addresses sort of streetscapes, signage and lighting, parking, gateways, parks and trails, landscaping features, and certainly the protection of some of those views. And we also talked about expanding those views, and those would then be correspondingly updated in the design guidelines. And I think the other important thing to note is that the urban design and heritage guidelines are intended to address those two elements we talked about of character at the beginning. Those are those design elements that relate to built form and design features that are in some cases recent and evolving and unique to Grimsby Beach. in terms of some of the paint colors, the gingerbread features, some of the murals. And there's also cultural heritage attributes as they're defined and protected under the Heritage Act. And so there's guidance as it relates to those particular built form characteristics as well. And those two things in the guidelines are intended to work together and not for one to detract from the other, because they are sort of different aspects of defining and protecting the character of the area. So I wanted to kind of convey that we will go through the guidelines and kind of reinforce and clarify that point. I know it's come up a few times, and I think it's really important to address that in the guidelines. In terms of the private development features, again, this really relates to those features that include, the built form and some of the architectural features, building heights, entrances, porches, windows, elements, roof design, construction materials, and landscaping. So guidance in relation to the design and architectural features of those built form elements. And then finally, as I mentioned, the cultural heritage attributes and cultural heritage properties and the conservation of those. So talking about things like adaptive reuse, additions, accessory structures, materials, fabrics, different features that would relate specifically to those that are listed and designated and identified for significance. So all of these come together in this document, and we've flagged some of the comments that have come in, and we'll go back through and make sure we incorporate those. And I understand that the Heritage Committee as well had an opportunity to have that information before them, and we certainly welcome those comments and input as well from the community. So that was, I think, the last slide, and we sort of end up here with final discussion, questions, and comments on those last few elements. And certainly, I think the importance here is to note that there will be continued opportunities to provide input. As we noted in one of the process slides, one of the key things now is to take the input from this evening and go back and look at further revisions and changes based on that input, coming back with further responses based on the comments and questions tonight. And then bringing this forward, I believe a public meeting is being scheduled in the new year, which gives another opportunity to identify some of the changes based on the comments we've received, and also to present that to council as well. So I will stop sharing my screen and just go back to staff. I'm looking to them to provide any final comments and questions that have come in.
Thanks, Dana. So we have two more right now. If an empty lot in the GB Legacy Zone is part of a historic vista to the lake and has historically been empty without a house on it to block the view, is there any way to protect that empty lot from infill, high lot coverage homes built on it, since it will change the historic vista?
So excellent question. And I will answer that by saying that the ability to obtain a building permit for a new home on that lot, because a dwelling unit would be a permitted use, would not be precluded. However, with the added policies, the added guidelines, and the added specific policies that relate to views, there would be some level of assessment and review that would be considered in terms of that development. It's an interesting question because as a vacant lot, again, with legacy, there isn't an existing footprint. So someone would be coming forward through a building permit and a site plan process to establish the home there. So the best we have is to add these additional policies and tools for the assessment of that development.
Okay, next question. Once this secondary plan is implemented, will it now qualify to be an area officially listed in the official plan as a cultural heritage landscape?
So that's an excellent question, and I'll refer back to those policies that we have identified under the provincial policy statement, the cultural heritage landscape features. So they are incorporated into the secondary plan, but we'll go back and look at that again. That's intended. And so we'll make sure that that's clarified in the secondary plan policies.
Great. And finally, I have, is the meeting in January going to be in person? So right now we're tentatively scheduled for January 17th. However, it is intended to be virtual.
Sorry, Antonetta, that's January 27th.
Oh, 27th. Sorry, I knew it had a 7 in it. Thank you for the correction,
Right.
Terry. Sorry, my apologies. So it is not planned to be in person. Okay, and then I don't know if this is a hand up from before or if it's a new question. I have a question from Nicole.
Hi, Nicole, can you hear me?
Hi, yeah, I do. So the first question obviously pertains to 33 Victoria Terrace and our submission of building 2 houses. I just want to tell the community that our original proposal was a board and batten house across both lots, and it was denied, and we were not able to deem it as one lot. And this is not a sob story or anything like that. I mean, it happened, and it was unfortunate. But I think that as a community, I mean, we really have to be careful about having too many policies and having things too prescriptive, because I can tell you from my own experience and my family's experience is that, you know, people come first, then it's houses. And, you know, it's really unfortunate that this happened to my family. But really consider the fact that this is a community, and you know, maybe we need to be a little bit more tolerant, and do we really need policies that are that prescriptive and that you know, impede upon people's own personal preferences and the ability just to get on with their lives? Sorry, I'm a little bit emotional here because, you know, we've gone through hell. But you know, I just think that, you know, we just need to be a little bit more tolerant, and, you know, and considerate of one another. Sorry. Not appropriate at this meeting for me to say this. I recognize that, but I just wanted to speak my piece. So thank you so much.
I appreciate that, Nicole.
Next, we have a question. The boundaries for the study are not the same as the CHL special places. How will you rectify that?
So I'll go back and take a look at that. Not sure what that's in reference to, but maybe that's something we can again talk offline and follow up through Bianca, so that we can make sure that we address that question.
Again, I could just add a little bit really quick. So the CHL special places was done along with, I believe it's 46 other CHLs, and each CHL would need to be vetted through a study. But we can proactively implement CHL policies within the secondary plan. So when we do that, it'll be ready for that.
Yeah.
Right. And I'll just add, the boundary of the study doesn't have to be the same boundary as the CHL.
Yeah.
Okay. And with that, I don't see anything else.
So maybe with that, I'll pass it back to you, Antonetta, but I just wanted to thank everyone. It's I think been a very good discussion tonight. Would love to have done this in person, but unfortunately we don't have that ability right now. But I really appreciate everyone coming out tonight, value your time, input and questions. I hope it's been helpful and informative. Again, lots of opportunity to continue to provide comments and input. I would encourage everyone tonight, and if you know of folks that weren't able to attend, to continue to follow up and provide your input and comments through to the town. And again, as the consultants on the study, we really appreciate the input from the community and the engagement, and really look forward to moving this forward in the new year with working with you.
Dana, besides echoing all of your sentiments, you know, gratitude to the community for their time, maybe I'll like to the MHBC team on this, and also to the staff, Bianca and Terry. Terry was feverishly typing in all the comments. I know Bianca's screenshotting everything so that we have all record of this, and we're going to incorporate all the feedback that we got tonight. So thank you for helping make this plan one that really is the voice of the community. And we look forward to our next session with you.
That's great. So with that, I'll say good night to everyone. And I know it's been recorded, so hopefully this is also available online. But thanks so much, everyone, and stay safe and have a great rest of the evening.